What if I told you that the President of the United States had to, physically sneak out of a bustling international airport hidden inside an ordinary catering truck, all because of an intelligence report that the CIA didn't even believe was true?
I mean, it sounds like the discarded script of a summer blockbuster,
Yeah.
right? Like the visual of the commander-in-chief huddled behind rows of airline food carts just to get onto a runway undetected. It's so extreme, it really forces you to question the entire decision-making apparatus of the government.
Which is exactly why today's stack of sources is so fascinating. We are pulling this apart, along with several other massive shifts, from a stack of excerpts from the Daily Grind News. Specifically, we're looking at the August 13th, 2026 edition of the Morning Sixpack newsletter by Bill Davis.
Right, but before we dive into all the mechanics of this, we really need to set a clear baseline for you, the listener, about the nature of the source material we're looking at today.
We absolutely do. So we have to be clear up front here. This independent newsletter contains politically charged editorial commentary and rhetoric from various points on the political spectrum. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of the viewpoints or editorializing in these sources. Our mission is strictly to report the factual events and impartially convey the author's arguments so you can understand the conversation that's, actually happening out there.
Exactly. We're just here to look at the gears turning beneath these events.
Yeah. And our guiding theme for today's deep dive is really about calculated risks and unintended consequences. We're going to explore how high-stakes decisions, whether they're made by the Secret Service, the Supreme Court, or global superpowers, create these massive, often unpredictable ripple effects that reshape everything. I mean, from geopolitical alliances to literally the price of the goods you buy every day.
So let's start with that catering truck in Turkey because, well, this is perhaps the most visceral example of a calculated risk in our stack today, primarily because it exposes a really deep fracture between how different arms of the U.S. government interpret the exact same information.
Okay, so the setup is the NATO summit in Turkey. Israeli intelligence sends a warning to the CIA, claiming they've uncovered an Iranian plot to assassinate Donald Trump. But the friction here is that the CIA takes a look at this data and they are highly skeptical.
Very skeptical.
Yeah. The Washington Post reported that current and former U.S. officials said the CIA analysts found the intelligence unconvincing. They categorized it as Israeli-derived, not U.S.-generated, and viewed as low confidence.
And the newsletter editor injects their own heavy skepticism into this as well. I mean, they explicitly referred to the Netanyahu government as lying and question if this intelligence was merely a calculated attempt by Israel to shape U.S. policy toward Iran and Turkey, rather than an actual genuine security warning.
But regardless of the CIA's doubts or the editor's skepticism, the Secret Service operates on a completely different frequency.
Oh, absolutely.
They don't wait around for the CIA to verify the data. They go into full-blown action movie mode and execute this incredibly elaborate deception operation. So, Trump boards the traditional Air Force One, the iconic VC-25 aircraft that everyone recognizes, right?
Right, the one with the classic blue and white paint job.
Exactly. The cameras see him go up the stairs. Everyone thinks he's there.
But he isn't staying there.
No. He secretly sneaks off the aircraft, gets loaded into an airport catering truck, rides across the tarmac completely hidden, and boards a totally different plane, a military C-32A transport plane.
Wow.
And then he flies to Britain with a full armed escort of F-16 fighter jets.
Okay, let's unpack this because looking at this functionally, I see two agencies essentially fighting over the definition of risk. It reminds me of the difference between a spam filter and a smoke detector.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it. Right, the CIA operates like a spam filter. Their job is to weed out the noise, the false positives, and only flag the 100% verified actionable threats. But the Secret Service operates like a smoke detector. It's designed to be highly sensitive and trigger a massive, deafening alarm, even if it's just burnt toast. Because, the cost of ignoring a real fire is total catastrophe.
That analogy perfectly captures the structural tension there. I mean, the CIA is literally paid to doubt, to analyze motives, to question the origin of intelligence. The Secret Service, by its very mandate, is paid to assume the absolute worst-case scenario is already happening.
Yeah, they can't afford to be wrong.
Exactly. And you have to factor in the historical context, framing their mindset right now. Officials emphasize that Trump has faced multiple threats, including specific ones from Iran, and there have been 3 previous assassination attempts or plots involving him. The Secret Service simply wasn't willing to gamble on whether a low-confidence warning might somehow slip through the cracks.
And Trump himself actually confirmed this dynamic, telling reporters, it's really just up to Secret Service. I just follow what they like to do. I do what they say. But here is the massive unintended consequence of this smoke detector approach to security.
The passenger list.
Yes. When Trump moved to that C-32A transport plane, he only took his most trusted inner circle with him. We're talking personal aide Natalie Harp, Deputy Chief of Staff Dan Scavino, and Oval Office Operations Director Walt Nauta.
Leaving the traditional cabinet heavyweights behind on the decoy plane.
Right. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Senior Advisor Stephen Miller, plus the entire White House press corps. They were all left sitting on the primary aircraft.
Just waiting there?
Yeah, the newsletter editor describes them as sitting ducks. And now congressional Democrats are demanding answers. They're asking the really obvious question. If that primary plane was deemed too dangerous for the president, what about the fatal risk forced upon the cabinet, the staff, and the press?
It reveals a really fascinating vulnerability in succession protocol versus reality. The editor notes this offered an unusually public, almost uncomfortably transparent look at who makes the cut when the stakes are life and death.
Right, because the titles didn't matter.
Exactly. Official titles like Secretary of State didn't matter nearly as much as deep, personal trust and physical proximity to the president. It forces you to wonder how functional a government can be if its top diplomats and economic minds are considered, expendable decoys in a crisis.
And speaking of economic minds, while the U.S. relies on its security apparatus to manage these acute physical threats on the global stage, we're also relying on our economic dominance to box out rivals like Iran. Which brings us to the next piece of this puzzle, the limits of financial warfare.
Right, the sanctions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The U.S. has hit Iran with massive sanctions, essentially weaponizing the U.S. dollar to lock them out of the global banking system. Add the ongoing war, and Iran's economy is just suffocating. Inflation is soaring, their currency is collapsing.
Well, when a nation is cornered economically like that, they don't just surrender, right? They look for an escape hatch. And Iranian central bank governor Abdul Nasser Hemati just announced they're aggressively pushing to join the BRICS New Development Bank, or NDB, ahead of an upcoming summit in India.
So let's actually define what that bank is doing, because it sounds like generic bureaucratic jargon, but it's actually a massive shift. The NDB was created by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Right, and it was explicitly designed as a counterweight to Western-dominated institutions like the World Bank and the IMF.
Okay.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the mechanics of global banking usually rely on the SWIFT system, which is deeply tied to the U.S. dollar. Because the U.S. controls the dollar, it can basically dictate who gets to use SWIFT.
Which is huge leverage.
Exactly. So if Iran wants to build sanitation systems, upgrade their digital infrastructure, or build ports, they need massive loans. But Western banks won't touch them because of U.S. sanctions. The NDB offers a parallel ecosystem where loans and trade can be settled in local currencies like the Chinese yuan or the Indian rupee, completely bypassing the U.S. dollar clearing system.
And China is obviously heavily incentivized to make this work, considering they are already buying over 80% of Iran's exported oil in 2025. In retaliation to this BRICS expansion, Trump has threatened 25% tariffs on imports from any countries that buy Iranian goods, labeling the entire BRICS bloc as anti-American.
And the newsletter editor points out a fundamental law of economic physics here. They wrote, when Washington closes one financial door, Tehran goes shopping for another.
Wait, here's where it gets really interesting, and I have to push back on this U.S. strategy, though. If Washington's primary goal is to keep hostile nations financially isolated and reliant on our rules, threatening 25% tariffs on half the developing world seems like it would completely backfire.
How so?
Well, aren't we just incentivizing them to build a walled-off economy where the U.S. dollar has absolutely zero leverage? Like, is this BRICS bank an actual existential threat to the U.S. economy? Or, as the newsletter editor asks, is it just another geopolitical club making noise?
You are hitting on the fundamental vulnerability of economic sanctions right there. The U.S. dollar's dominance is America's most powerful non-lethal weapon. It gives Washington incredible leverage. But it's a decaying asset if you overuse it.
Right.
When you sanction a small economy, they suffer. When you sanction or threaten tariffs against a massive bloc of nations like BRICS, which represents a huge chunk of the global population and resources, you give them the critical mass they need to actually fund and sustain a parallel system.
Which is exactly what they're trying to do with the NDB.
Yes. Whether this NDB infrastructure can truly rival the liquidity and trust of the West is, as the editor says, the trillion-dollar question. but the mechanism of pushing them away
Yeah.
actively accelerates their motivation to try.
Okay, so we just got a massive reminder that the president's economic power has severe limits, not just globally, but right here at home. This is a massive domestic whiplash. We just talked about Trump threatening 25% tariffs on BRICS nations, but a previous set of his emergency tariffs was just struck down by the Supreme Court.
Yes, that was a huge ruling.
And the unintended consequence of that specific ruling is staggering. It has created a sudden, massive windfall for corporate America.
To understand how this happened, you really have to look at the legal mechanism the administration tried to use. The Supreme Court invalidated tariffs that were imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
No, IEP was designed in the 1970s, right? Like, it was meant to give the president the power to freeze the assets of foreign adversaries during a national security crisis.
Precisely. But recent administrations began stretching the definition of a national emergency to use IEP as a workaround to unilaterally impose tariffs, bypassing Congress, which, constitutionally holds the power to tax.
Right, the power of the purse.
Exactly. The Supreme Court essentially ruled that using a 1970s asset freezing law as a backdoor to levy billions in taxes stretches executive power past the breaking point.
So the tariffs were deemed illegal.
So the law is struck down, and the mechanical reality of that ruling is that U.S. Customs and Border Protection is now processing nearly $129 billion in refund claims. Roughly $100 billion of that is already moving rapidly through the Treasury.
It's an astronomical amount of money.
It really is. More than 40 S&P 500 companies have already disclosed $9.6 billion in refunds just for themselves. General Motors got $500 million, Amazon got $640 million, FedEx $800 million, Nike $986 million.
The speed of this capital injection is catching markets completely off guard.
And listen to where this money is actually going. Apple is getting a $2.2 billion check from the government for a policy they opposed in the first place.
That single refund added 11 cents a share to their latest quarterly earnings, making up 5% of their total earnings for the quarter. I mean, this is like finding a crumpled $20 bill in your winter coat, except for Apple. It's $2.2 billion.
It is a phenomenal injection of cash. But it requires us to look at the mechanics of supply chain pricing to really understand the controversy here. When a tariff is applied at customs, the foreign manufacturer doesn't pay it. The importer of record, the U.S. corporation bringing the goods into the country, pays that tax to the U.S. government.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here on behalf of anyone listening who buys groceries or electronics. Because if the importer pays the tax at the border, we all know they don't just eat that cost.
Right.
They bake that extra cost into the final retail price. The consumer at the register is the one who actually paid for these tariffs over the last few years. So legally, the refund goes to the corporation, but morally or practically, do you and I see any of this money?
That is the multi-billion-dollar disconnect. Legally, the government owes the entity that wrote the check at the border. What those entities do with the refund varies wildly.
Like what?
Well, FedEx and Costco have gone on record stating they will attempt to pass these refunds back to their customers in some form, likely through adjusted shipping rates or pricing. Amazon stated they want to refund customers where they can directly trace the specific tariff costs to a specific purchase and otherwise use the broader pool of money to keep future prices low.
But Apple,
based on current disclosures, appears to be absorbing it directly into their earnings reports, essentially rewarding their shareholders.
Yeah, the newsletter editor has a deeply cynical but honestly prescient take on this. They wrote, funny how corporations will eat the tariffs turned into corporations are getting refund checks. Economics always has a way of making political talking points expire.
It's very true.
And they predict that the moment this massive pool of refund cash dries up, these exact same corporations might suddenly pivot, claiming poverty and lobbying for tax cuts or bailouts. The consumer paid the inflated price, the Supreme Court fought the legal battle, and the corporate headquarters simply pockets the ultimate refund.
It is the ultimate unintended consequence of reversing a major economic policy. You can't just undo years of consumer pricing by writing a check to a headquarters.
No, you really can't. So we spent a lot of time looking at these massive, sweeping policies from 30,000 feet, sanctions, Supreme Court rulings, presidential decoys. But to truly understand how this government functions, we have to look at the people on the front lines, the people who actually have to execute or defend these policies every single day.
And the sources provide a really stark, jarring contrast between two very different types of frontline government service.
Yeah. On the one hand, you have the realm of political messaging. Caroline Leavitt is stepping down as White House press secretary at the end of the month. Trump praised her work, announcing she'll remain as an outside advisor. But her tenure in the briefing room was uniquely explosive.
Definitely. Time magazine described her tenure as being remembered as much for confrontations with reporters as for actually delivering the administration's message.
Right. In one exchange with an AP reporter over the very economic policies we were just dissecting, she snapped, "I think it's insulting that you're trying to test my knowledge of economics. I now regret giving a question to the Associated Press."
Wow.
Yeah. She called another reporter a left-wing hack during a dispute over IC statistics. She told CNN's Caitlin Collins, "You're a reporter, you should find out."
If you look at the mechanics of the modern press briefing, this behavior makes complete sense. Her supporters saw this as her boldly standing up to a hostile press corps. Critics saw it as an administration treating the media as an enemy combatant, but functionally the role has just shifted.
So, what does this all mean for how we get our information? When you look at those interactions, it seems the White House briefing room is no longer an information-gathering mechanism for print journalists. It has evolved into a content creation studio for social media algorithms.
That's a great way to put it.
The goal isn't to meticulously explain policy nuances. It's for the press secretary to act as the main character in a televised sparring match. The viral clips of her owning a reporter generate far more engagement and project the administration's combative stance far more effectively than a dry policy readout ever could. It is performative combat.
Performative combat is the exact right term. It's highly successful for a digital medium that rewards outrage and conflict. But that performative combat sits in devastating contrast to the actual, untelevised execution of national security, which carries real, fatal risks.
Which brings us to the final story in the newsletter. Far away from the cameras and the viral clips in Washington, an Army AH-64 Apache helicopter crashed during a routine training mission near Fort Hood, Texas.
The details are just sobering. Both crew members aboard were killed. The crash was so violent it ignited a severe brush fire that required nearby homes in the community to be evacuated. Bell County Sheriff's Office spokesman Cliff Coleman described the wreckage as severe.
And the acting Fort Hood commander, Brig General Ethan Diven, didn't have time to craft a viral soundbite. He had to immediately focus on the physical reality of securing a crash site and supporting the families of 2 fallen soldiers.
The newsletter editor notes something here that grounds our entire discussion today. They wrote, "Military aviation remains one of the most demanding jobs anywhere. Even routine training carries real risks."
It stops you in your tracks, doesn't it?
It really strips away all the abstraction. We spend our time debating the intricacies of geopolitics, the leverage of SWIFT and BRICS, the legality of IEEPA tariffs, and the optics of presidential security details. But behind every single grand strategy cooked up in a boardroom or a situation room, there is a stark human reality. The true physical burden of national security isn't borne by the people arguing in the briefing room. It is borne by the service members who strap into an Apache helicopter on a Wednesday in Texas just to maintain readiness.
It brings everything we've talked about full circle. None of these events happen in a vacuum. The news isn't a list of separate, isolated stories. It is a highly volatile ecosystem of actions and reactions.
Absolutely.
I mean, we started today looking at a president sneaking onto a catering truck in Turkey, driven by a piece of intelligence the CIA didn't even fully trust. We followed the economic leverage to Iran, watching how our own sanctions might inadvertently be funding the architecture of a rival global financial empire.
Right.
We saw the Supreme Court's attempt to rein in executive overreach accidentally hand corporations a $100 billion payday, while the consumers who actually pay the toll get nothing. And we ended with the absolute heartbreaking contrast between the performative brawls of politics and the fatal reality of those actually defending the nation.
It really forces you to question the illusion of control. We want to believe that statecraft is a meticulously planned chess match, where every move is calculated 10 steps ahead. But the mechanics of these stories suggest something much more chaotic.
Because every policy has an unintended consequence that ultimately impacts our daily lives, our wallets, and the lives of those on the front lines. Which leaves us with this final thought for you to mull over today.
Go for it.
If low-confidence intelligence can force the leader of the free world to hide among airline food carts, and if a single Supreme Court ruling can suddenly inject $100 billion back into corporate coffers overnight, how much of our global stability actually relies on grand, multi-year master plans, and how much of it is just sudden, split-second reactions to complete uncertainty?
It makes you wonder, Are we watching architects build a future, or are we just watching people desperately trying to catch falling glass?
That is a great question to leave off on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We appreciate you taking the time to unpack all of this with us.